I never wanted to believe my parents played favorites, but deep down, I always knew. It was in the way my mother's eyes lit up whenever my younger brother Jason walked into the room, while my presence barely registered. It was in the way my father spoke about his pride and joy, how Jason was destined for great things, while I was expected to simply manage. It was in the quiet dismissals, the sighs of indifference whenever I accomplished something, and the endless sacrifices I was expected to make without question. From the moment Jason was born, he was treated like a prince. If he scraped his knee, the world stopped. If he failed a test, there was always an excuse. If he wanted something, he got it. No hesitation, no questions asked. Meanwhile, I learned early on that if I wanted something, I had to earn it myself. I got my first part-time job at 16, saving up for things Jason would be handed without a second thought. My parents were never outright cruel to me. It was more subtle than that, neglect disguised as fairness, favoritism wrapped in feigned impartiality. If I ever dared to complain, I was met with the same tired response. We love you both equally. But actions speak louder than words, and theirs were deafening. I worked hard, not just for myself, but because I hoped, maybe, that if I achieved enough, they'd see me the way they saw him. So I pushed myself. I studied late into the night while Jason partied with his friends. I got a scholarship to a prestigious university, while Jason barely made it through community college. And when I landed a stable job with a good salary, my parents acted as though it was expected of me, as if there had never been another outcome. Jason, on the other hand, drifted from one failed venture to the next, burning through every opportunity my parents handed him. First, it was a car detailing business that went under in 6 months. Then it was a half-hearted attempt at real estate, which ended in debt my parents quietly paid off. Most recently, he had been finding himself, which meant living at home, unemployed, without a single plan for the future. Despite all of this, my parents never wavered in their belief that he deserved the world, and somehow I was supposed to help provide it for him. Jason just needs a little support, my mother would say, stirring her coffee like she was discussing the weather. You've always been the responsible one, Rachel. They leaned on me constantly, treating my success as their safety net. It started small, helping with bills here and there, covering an unexpected expense when Jason needed a break. But over time, it became an expectation. My father's retirement fund was running low, my mother's health insurance wasn't enough, Jason needed help getting back on his feet. And so I did what I always did. I helped. I convinced myself I was doing the right thing. After all, they were my parents. They had raised me, hadn't they? They had provided for me, hadn't they? It was only fair that I gave back. So I funneled money into their retirement savings, ensuring they'd be taken care of when the time came. I covered costs Jason was supposed to handle, believing foolishly that one day he'd step up. And still, no matter what I gave, it was never enough. Why do you always make us feel like a burden? My father scoffed after I hesitated when they asked for yet another loan. We'd do the same for you. I almost laughed at that, because when had they ever? When I needed help with my college tuition, they told me to take out loans. When I wanted to move into my first apartment, they said I should manage on my own. When I struggled with medical bills after an accident, they reminded me that I had a steady job unlike Jason. But I kept giving, kept sacrificing, because that's what a good daughter was supposed to do. It wasn't until much later that I learned the full extent of their betrayal. That my late aunt, my mother's sister, had left behind a sizable inheritance. And that money? It had been meant for me. I wasn't supposed to find out. That was the part that stung the most. They had hidden it so well, buried it so deep, and if it hadn't been for one careless mistake, I might have gone my whole life never knowing. It happened on an ordinary Sunday. I had stopped by my parents' house to drop off a check, another contribution toward their ever-growing list of unexpected expenses. My mother was in the kitchen, humming to herself as she sorted through a pile of old papers, some of which had been pulled from a dusty filing cabinet. What's all this? I asked, glancing at the stack of faded envelopes and crumpled documents. Spring cleaning? I teased. Just getting rid of some old paperwork, she replied without looking up. No need to keep all this clutter. Something about the way she said it made me pause. My mother wasn't the type to throw things away unless she had to. I reached for one of the envelopes, but before I could pick it up, she snatched it off the counter. Nothing important, she said too quickly, and that's when I saw it. A name printed on the corner of the envelope. My aunt's name, Aunt Margaret. I froze. It had been years since she passed away, but I still remembered her so vividly. She had been my mother's older sister, a woman with a sharp wit and an even sharper sense of justice. Unlike my parents, she had always treated me as if I mattered. She had taken an interest in my life, encouraged me to chase my dreams, and reminded me on more than one occasion that I deserved more than the scraps I had grown used to accepting. "What's that?" I asked, nodding toward the letter in my mother's hand. She hesitated. "Nothing," she repeated, but I didn't believe her. My mother was many things, but she had never been a good liar. I reached for the stack of papers she hadn't managed to hide. My fingers skimmed over old receipts, tax forms, medical bills, until I found something that made my breath catch. A legal document. An official letter from a law firm, dated shortly after my aunt's death. I skimmed the words quickly, my pulse hammering in my ears. Estate, beneficiary, funds allocated, my name. I felt the world tilt. "What is this?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. My mother exhaled slowly, setting the envelope down as if it burned her fingers. "Rachel, it's not what you think," she murmured. I stared at her. "It says Aunt Margaret left me an inheritance, a significant one. And I never got it," she flinched. Your father and I, we didn't think you needed it." I almost laughed at the sheer audacity of it. "You didn't think I needed it?" I repeated, stunned. "You were doing well on your own," she insisted, wringing her hands together. "You had your scholarships, your job, your own place. But Jason, he was struggling. He needed help." A deep, sickening realization settled in my stomach. "You took my inheritance and gave it to Jason." My mother's silence was answer enough. I felt something inside me crack wide open. "How much?" I demanded. "How much did she leave me?" She opened her mouth, but before she could answer, my father's voice came from the doorway. "Rachel, calm down." I spun to face him. "Calm down?" I asked, my voice shaking. "You stole from me. You kept this from me for years. And you want me to calm down?" "It wasn't stealing," he snapped. "It was doing what was best for the family. Jason needed it more than you did." The rage that erupted inside me was unlike anything I had ever felt before. Every moment of being pushed aside, every sacrifice I had made, every time they had asked for my help while knowing they had already taken what was rightfully mine, it all came crashing down. "How dare you?" I whispered. "How dare you decide that for me?" My mother's face crumpled. "Rachel, please, we didn't think you'd mind." I let out a hollow laugh. "You didn't think I'd mind? That's because you never thought about me at all." Jason? Of course, it had all gone to Jason. "How much was it?" I asked again. Neither of them answered. I looked at my father. "Tell me." His jaw tightened. "A little over 100,000. The air left my lungs. $100,000. Enough to have changed my life. Enough to have wiped away my debts, given me a real safety net, or allowed me to invest in my future. Instead, it had gone to Jason to fund his laziness, his failures, his excuses. I felt something cold settle over me. I looked at my parents, these people who had raised me, who had told me they loved me while robbing me blind, and realized something. I was done. I walked out of my parents' house that day, feeling like my entire life had been a lie. The betrayal settled in my bones, twisting into something dark, something I could barely contain. They had stolen from me, not just money, an inheritance meant to give me a future, security, a chance at something better. They had made that decision without hesitation, without guilt, because they had never once seen me as someone who deserved anything. Jason needed it more. The words replayed in my head over and over, each time stoking the fire in my chest. Jason, the same Jason who had never held a job for more than a few months, the same Jason who had burned through every dollar they had ever handed him, the same Jason who lived in their house rent-free while I had been told to figure it out on my own. I sat in my car, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. The worst part was, they weren't even sorry. Not really. My father had looked me in the eye and told me to calm down. My mother had only seemed regretful because she had gotten caught. I had given them everything, and they had taken even more. I wasn't just angry, I was done. For years, I had been their safety net. I had paid bills, covered emergencies, contributed to their retirement savings, the money they never seemed to have for themselves because they were always bailing Jason out. I had justified it, convinced myself that it was my responsibility as their daughter, that I was simply helping because that's what family did. But what had they done for me? The answer was painfully clear. Nothing. I took a deep breath, my pulse still racing, and pulled out my phone. I scrolled through my banking app, finding the automatic transfers I had set up for their retirement fund. A significant chunk of my paycheck, gone every month without question. Money I had thought I was giving in good faith. Not anymore. With a few taps, I canceled everything. A message popped up confirming the changes, and for the first time in my life, I felt something I hadn't expected. Relief. The next morning, the phone calls started. "Rachel, sweetie, there must be some mistake," my mother's voice chirped through the receiver. "Your transfer didn't come through this month." I barely blinked. "It's not a mistake," I said flatly. A pause, then a nervous chuckle. "Oh, well, maybe you just forgot to set it up again after you changed banks? You know, that can happen sometimes," she said quickly. "I didn't forget," I replied. "I canceled it." The silence on the other end was deafening. "What do you mean you canceled it?" she asked, her voice rising. "I mean, I'm done giving you money," I said, my voice steady. "You had plenty. You just gave it to Jason." "Rachel, that was different," she started, but I cut her off. "No, Mom. What's different is that you don't get to steal from me and still expect my help. You and Dad made your choice. Now you get to live with it." "Rachel, please," she begged. "We need that money for our future." I let out a bitter laugh. "You should have thought about that before you funneled my inheritance into Jason's failures." Her breath hitched. "We're your parents," she whispered, as if that was enough to excuse what they had done. "And I'm your daughter," I shot back, "not your personal bank account." I hung up before she could say another word. The calls kept coming, first from my mother, then from my father, and finally, predictably, from Jason. "Seriously, Rachel?" Jason scoffed when I finally answered. "You're really being this dramatic over some money?" I nearly threw my phone across the room. "It wasn't just some money," I snapped. "It was $100,000 that was meant for me, not for you, not for your bad investments or your get-rich-quick schemes. Me." Jason sighed like I was the one being unreasonable. "You've always had a stick up your ass about money," he muttered. My jaw clenched. "And you've always expected other people to support you," I shot back. "Oh, come on," he groaned. "Mom and Dad were just trying to help me out. They knew you'd be fine. You're like obsessed with working." "I work because I have to," I said through gritted teeth. "Because unlike you, I don't have people handing me everything." "You have a good job," he argued. "You make plenty. What's the big deal?" "The big deal," I spat, "is that you stole from me and you still have the audacity to ask why I won't keep supporting Mom and Dad when all they do is clean up after you." Jason scoffed. "God, Rachel, you're so selfish." I barked out a humorless laugh. "You're calling me selfish?" "You're abandoning our parents," he accused. "You think I can afford to take care of them on my own?" I felt nothing but ice in my veins. "Not my problem." Jason's voice turned sharp. "You'll regret this." No, Jason, I said, voice calm. I think this is the first decision I won't regret. I hung up. The fallout was immediate. My mother called crying. My father sent guilt-ridden texts about how family was supposed to help each other. Jason sulked and sent snide messages about how I was ruining everything. But I didn't answer. For the first time, I didn't feel obligated to. I had spent years bending over backward to make their lives easier, thinking that if I just kept giving, they would see me as more than just the reliable one. But I was done chasing validation that would never come. I wasn't their insurance plan. I wasn't Jason's safety net. I was finally free. The silence was unnerving. After weeks of relentless calls, guilt-tripping texts, and desperate attempts to wear me down, my parents had suddenly gone quiet. At first, I thought they had given up, finally realizing that I meant what I said. But I should have known better. My family never accepted things they didn't like. They schemed, they manipulated, they twisted reality until it fit their narrative. And this time, I knew exactly what they were planning. So when my father called and left a message saying they wanted to talk things over like adults, I wasn't surprised. And when Jason sent a text saying, "You should come by, Mom isn't doing well," I knew it was a setup. But I went anyway, not because I thought they would suddenly take responsibility, not because I was looking for an apology, but because I was ready to end this, once and for all. I walked into my parents' house, a place that used to feel like home, but now felt suffocating. My mother sat on the couch, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue, while my father paced the living room. Jason leaned against the wall, arms crossed, watching me with that same smug expression he always wore when he thought he was about to get his way. "I'm glad you came," my father said, his tone measured, controlled, as if he were the reasonable one in this situation. "We need to talk." "I doubt that," I said coolly. My mother let out a shaky breath. "Rachel, this is getting out of hand. We are a family. Families don't abandon each other," she said, voice trembling just enough to sound pitiful. "You abandoned me the moment you decided my inheritance belonged to Jason," I said, folding my arms. Jason scoffed. "Oh my God, you're still whining about that?" he said, rolling his eyes. I turned to him sharply. "You stole $100,000 from me," I said, voice cold. "That's not something I just get over." Jason waved a dismissive hand. "You act like it was all at once. It was over time," he said, as if that somehow made it better. My father stepped in. "We didn't do it to hurt you, Rachel. You have to understand, Jason needed help," he said, his voice firm but patronizing. "And I didn't?" I asked. "I was struggling too. I had student loans, rent, medical bills, and you didn't think I needed my own money?" "You were doing fine," my mother whispered, my hands clenched at my sides. "I was barely doing fine, but I made it work. You never even considered that maybe I needed that money, because you never cared about my struggles," I said, shaking my head. "Rachel, we thought you'd be the one to understand," my father sighed, rubbing his temples. Jason smirked. "Yeah, because you always act like you're so independent. Guess you're not as self-sufficient as you pretend to be," he said mockingly. I took a deep breath, steadying myself. "You're right, I am independent, and that's exactly why I'm here," I said, reaching into my bag and pulling out a folder. I tossed it onto the coffee table. My mother frowned. "What's this?" she asked cautiously. I sat down, leveling them all with a calm, unwavering stare. "Since you've been using me as your financial safety net all these years, I decided to check just how dependent you've been on me," I said. I flipped open the folder. Inside were bank statements, transaction records, and a breakdown of every payment I had made toward their mortgage, their retirement fund, and Jason's countless failures. "I went through everything," I continued, "and I realized that in the past 5 years alone, I've given you over $80,000. My father's face paled. That can't be right," he muttered. Jason frowned. "That's not possible. You're not that generous," he sneered. I tapped the papers. "Feel free to check the numbers yourself, but it's all there. Every bill I covered, every loan that was never repaid, Every time you called me saying you just needed a little help." My mother let out a weak gasp. "Rachel, I'm not finished," I interrupted. "Because, you see, when I cut off your retirement contributions, I assumed you'd be fine. You always made it seem like it was just extra help, right?" I asked, tilting my head. No one said a word. I smirked. "Except that was a lie, wasn't it?" I continued. "Turns out you've been using my money to cover the majority of your retirement plan. And without it, you're barely scraping by." My father stiffened. Jason's jaw tightened. My mother's lip quivered. I let the silence stretch before delivering the final blow. "So here's what's going to happen," I said. "You will not be getting another cent from me. Not now, not ever. If that means you have to sell the house, then so be it. If that means Jason has to finally grow up and get a real job, then good luck. But I am done being your personal bank." My mother's tears turned desperate. "Rachel, please," she whimpered. My father's voice was tight. "You don't mean that," he said, though I could hear the fear behind his words. Jason's face was red. "You can't just cut them off like that," he shouted. I stood up. "Watch me." My father's voice cracked. "Rachel, you have to think about our future," he pleaded. I turned back to look at them. At the people who had used me without hesitation. At the brother who had mocked me for not handing over even more. "I did think about your future," I said, heading for the door, "and I decided that it's not my problem anymore." I walked out without looking back. The first few weeks after cutting my parents off were eerily quiet. No calls, no texts, no guilt-tripping messages. For the first time in my life, I wasn't carrying the weight of their problems. The silence should have been unsettling, but instead, it felt like freedom. Of course, it didn't last. One afternoon, my phone buzzed with an unknown number. I debated ignoring it, but curiosity won. "Rachel, it's your father," he said, his voice stiff, controlled. I leaned back in my chair. "What do you want?" I asked, unimpressed. He hesitated. "Your mother and I have been struggling since your decision," he admitted reluctantly. I let the words settle, waiting for the inevitable follow-up. "We might have to sell the house," he continued. "Your mother is beside herself. You don't know how hard this has been on her," he added, as if that was supposed to make me feel guilty. I felt nothing. "Then sell it," I said simply. His breath hitched. "Rachel, this is your childhood home," he reminded me. I exhaled slowly, shaking my head. "No, Dad. It was just a place where I was always second best," I said, my voice calm. A beat of silence, then, his tone sharpened. "I never thought you could be this heartless," he said. I smiled. "And I never thought you could steal from your own daughter. Guess we both underestimated each other," I said. His frustration bled through the phone. "We were trying to do what was best for the family," he said. "No," I corrected. "You were trying to do what was best for Jason. And now you can let him take care of you," I said before hanging up. That was the last time I answered their calls. Jason, on the other hand, wasn't nearly as composed. He sent messages filled with insults, whining about how I was selfish and cruel for abandoning them. It was amusing, really, how quickly he turned to rage the moment his gravy train dried up. I ignored every single one. The final straw came when he showed up at my apartment, pounding on my door. "Rachel, open up!" he shouted. I cracked the door open just enough to see his face. He looked furious, but underneath the anger, I saw something else panic. "You need to fix this," he demanded. "Mom's losing it, Dad won't stop stressing, and I can't afford to deal with their mess," he snapped. I tilted my head. "Sounds rough," I said with mock sympathy. "Don't do that," he growled. "This is your fault." I let out a soft laugh. "No, Jason, this is your fault. You took my money, wasted it, and expected me to keep paying for your life. Now you get to deal with the consequences," I said, my voice cold. His hands clenched into fists. "You think you're better than me?" he spat. I smiled. "No, I know I am," I said before shutting the door in his face. After that, the messages stopped. The phone calls ended. The silence returned, and this time it was permanent. With the money I had once funneled into their lives, I started taking care of my own future. I paid off the last of my student loans. I put money into investments. I even took a trip, one I had always wanted but never justified spending on. I was finally living for myself. A few months later, I ran into my aunt's old lawyer at a coffee shop. "Rachel, how have you been?" he asked warmly. I smiled, genuinely. "Better than ever," I said. He studied me for a moment before nodding approvingly. "Margaret would be proud of you," he said. I swallowed hard. "I hope so," I murmured. "She always said you were the strong one," he said. "That's why she left it to you. She knew you'd do something with it." I blinked back the sting of unexpected emotion. "I just wish I'd known sooner," I admitted. He sighed. "She suspected your parents might try something, but I don't think even she realized how far they'd go," he said. I nodded slowly. "Well, it doesn't matter anymore. They got what they wanted, and now they get to live with it," I said. The lawyer chuckled. "Good for you," he said. And for the first time in my life, I really, truly believed it.